Welcome back to Leading Tourism's Transition, where we've been looking at futures, foresight and practice together with Birthe Menke, and we've also sat down with some very experienced individuals who've helped us navigate this topic. In episode 1, we started by looking at how we might consider our role as changemakers and the sense of agency that we can all embrace and adopt when looking at futures and foresight. We did this together with Peter Bishop, founder and executive director of Teach the Future. In episode 2, we looked at 2050 and where are things headed. We asked a lot of challenging questions, but we also tried to see if there is any sense of predictability that can be found by looking at trends and looking at the disruptors that perhaps help us predict or identify the trajectory of things to come or the risk of things going off course. And in this third and final episode, I'll be sitting down with Birthe and discussing on what we've learned to date. We will reflect on those conversations, but we'll also turn our heads to thinking about some of those first-hand perspectives that both of us have seen working in the field and amongst practitioners. We'll be building on those first-hand observations, and we'll be considering one of the most pressing matters, which is sustainability, and how this is being tackled in tourism right now. We'll explore the industry's readiness to look further ahead, to construct and consider different future scenarios, and ultimately we'll be looking at how to create better engagement where everybody becomes a benefactor in the construction of a tourism future we might imagine as a force for good. So, I hope you enjoy this last episode in the series. Don't forget, if you do like the series or any of the episodes you've heard to date, be sure to leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you haven't already done so, hit subscribe so that you don't miss a future episode. So I'm back with Birthe, or B, as I think you prefer to be called. Great to be catching up with you, B, on this third episode in this 3-part series, where we've been focusing on something that you have been doing a lot of research on for your PhD, futures, foresight, and today I really want to dig into practice. Perhaps that's my comfort zone. But before we jump into the conversation around that, perhaps you can give a little bit of recap. What's been your take on this series so far?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me again for this last of the 3 episodes where we just start out with a quick recap of what we've talked about in the last couple of sessions, because they were, as you've probably noticed, quite different. So we started out with Peter, who gave us a general introduction into futures thinking and foresight, and who touched upon working with futures as an attitude or an ability that he, as part of his academic practice, was teaching, and that he's now with an organization that works with young people, really spreading on a large scale. And then in comparison or in contrast, we talked to Ian, who is highly proficient in tourism specifically, and who works as a futurologist in tourism, who really maintains a particular kind of oversight that he thinks is limited to an exclusive few experts in the field who work with the subject. And that's what he also stated, is that he thinks this particular ability should be located with organizations like DMOs, who can assist other businesses in tourism maintain a level of oversight and maintain a level of understanding as to what we're currently dealing with in the industry. So I think this contrast was actually really interesting and a good, well, now maybe tool or point of reference for us to get into, okay, what kind of level of futures thinking might the listener want to cultivate, and what's maybe left to others that we then consult with on a project or on a case-to-case basis.
I have to say, this has been really enlightening for me because we've done quite a few different small collaborations. And I think there's been this really great opportunity to learn from you, Birthe. And whilst most of what we've done together, you've been a fly on the wall that's been observing us. But I think we've been able to see just a few different perspectives that you've been able to pick up and gather and take on through your research. And when it comes to this podcast series, we've seen, as you say, those 2 enormously different, diverging views on how to even begin thinking about the future. And in our case, the future of tourism. But of course, we know when we put sustainability into that, and society and the planet and all of those macro level things that are creating pressures, we understand that it's much bigger. And so we have this one kind of, I thought it was fascinating to hear Ian's approach, which was almost prescriptive. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. And this is almost certainly going to happen. And then Peter's view seemed to really be about considering what you might not expect to happen. So almost considering what might happen, what could happen, and how you might be prepared for that. And culturally speaking, they seem to be diametrically opposite to each other. Is that something you've come across a lot in conducting your research and when you've seen this in the field in practice?
I think there's certainly a range of opinion leaders in the field, right? Like the kind of people whose work you always come across, regardless of whether you work in a specific area like tourism or if you work with futures thinking and futuring in general. So yeah, I would say there's a few organizations and individuals who really carry that conversation. And in tourism, Ian is certainly one of the people that people know simply from his publications, that stretch all the way out into 2050, and the very elaborate casework that he does on specific types of tourism in specific types of locations, simply because he's really drawn out, the mega trends that are unfolding in the world, and then asked himself, what does this mean for tourism specifically? And I've definitely also come across more people like Peter, who are really on a mission to spread the word, to lead to people to use this innate ability to think ahead that we have, to sort of, learn how to work with dreading change as well, because we also do that. But yeah, this other approach to really wanting to reach the wide masses and having a mission of getting people in the everyday to remember that we're able to think about preferred futures and that we're able to go there to make that a reality. I think there's definitely people of both of their professions, if you want to call it that anybody can really start following when, honestly, just looking into LinkedIn, the amount of really good content there is by a few opinion leaders, by a few organizations that work with the subject, and then starting to connect around the subject in, all sorts of, there's always free resources. We can actually really meet people from the communities like the one that Peter's cultivating.
Do you find that organizations and industry, when we think about this in practice, are creating space to think about futures, to consider different scenarios? Certainly, I would say maybe from my experience working with DMOs, there's always a willingness and even a drive to plan and to seek opportunities, to see what's on the horizon. But it's also tends to be with a view to a sort of a specific time frame, which tends to also be quite short. And when there is a longer time frame, it's because it's a symbolic round number. So 2030 strategies are starting to evolve. And I almost wonder, why 2030? Why not 2029? So, when I think about what I see in tourism, they're very narrowly focused on how we can meet our objectives as a tourism organization by this date or by this year, and setting that out step by step. There's usually a bit of room for inspiration about what might be and how things might look. But at the same time, they don't seem to explore to the degree that, certainly in the conversation with Peter, we really considered very, very different things and very different ways of thinking about scenarios.
Yeah, it always seems that creative thinking and imaginative thinking is the sort of thing that isn't part of professional practice right now. It seems that thinking so far ahead, be it 2029 or 2030 or 2050 or 64 and a half, is something that requires a certain kind of willingness to step into the unknown, to maybe say things out loud that others might find completely ridiculous because they live in a slightly differently composed reality. And I think that poses a certain risk in the kind of jobs that we have in tourism right now, because the industry itself is relatively pragmatic in the sense that, it carries out the thing that we know how to do. And that is, how to let people have a good time, how to help people escape from their working realities for a little while. And the more imaginative aspects, I think, are really locked with product development in tourism. And I think it would be cool if we could find ways to step out of that pragmatic thinking and then move into the more imaginative. But of course, that's difficult to measure, and putting numbers as to, okay, how much value, how much monetary value can we actually attribute to a part of a process that is imaginative, that's really difficult, because that usually involves participation. And that's something that Ian also brought forward. He said making futures is a participatory undertaking. You cannot make futures alone. It requires others. And the participatory aspects of projects are usually already really difficult to finance, because you can't really say what might come out. You might not even be able to tell how long it might take. And so then adding another level of uncertainty and saying, well, then imagine something else that might, for one, really divert from what's currently going on and actually lead people to become very critical with what's happening today. Of course, that's a risk factor. And then, the inability to actually squeeze that into a predefined time frame is really difficult. So I think we need to find ways to appreciate parts of a process that cannot be economically predicted in the very beginning. And that makes sense the way that came out.
Yeah, it certainly does. I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head in a sense that we have to demonstrate results in what we do. And there are always investors, whether that's the government directly investing in tourism activities, whether that's the private sector co-investing or directly investing. And those results need to usually demonstrate a return within a time frame which everybody feels is acceptable. And that return also generally has to be a profitable return. And I think this is where we see now tourism moving and changing a lot at the moment. We've seen sustainability has been put on the agenda. I think it would be certainly true to say that sustainability is a priority that the majority of DMOs have certainly incorporated into their rhetoric, into the narrative around the destination. And of course, we're all aware of things like greenwashing, and we definitely don't want to get into that today. But I do wonder if we can really achieve or go forwards with something like sustainability without incorporating some of the practices that you've helped us become more aware of, and also more aware of the importance of that. Because sustainability, of course, it has an economic aspect, but it also has an aspect which is about the purpose of trying to address sustainability. And if we put those into short-term timeframes and very specific outcomes, well, it seems hard to see how we can address the real underlying issues if we talk about reducing the impact, the carbon impact that our industry has, and the role that a destination can play in that, for example. What have your thoughts been on that? What have you seen? I think the sustainability is really the area that you've examined the most in your research.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting part of the process that I think we went through together to a large extent when we were prepared for Ex-Design Week last year, because we translated, the SDGs into like future possible statements, not looking at a world without poverty or hunger, but a world with enough, let's say, for everybody. And that actually brought to the fore the fact that a lot of people have difficulty relating to the future and relating to the kind of preferable futures that the SDGs envision and that our strategies are actually, or should be, working towards. And so this dissonance between where are we actually going beyond this 5-year strategy, that's been such a taken for granted thing that I think many people actually don't have an idea of, okay, what kind of world does what we do in the present and our sustainability efforts, what kind of world does that favor? And of course, when your strategy is about, let's say, reducing poverty, just keeping it relatively simple, but we're not simple in political terms, but simple in the sense of one of the early SDGs as an absolute no-brainer, then reducing poverty is one approach to doing it. And saying, okay, what are the measurements? How can we bring down the numbers of people below a certain income level, for example? But then looking at the situation the other way around and turning sustainability into, well, a future state. Let's say, okay, what would be a world without poverty? Would that mean that everybody has enough to eat, probably, that people have enough money to provide shelter for themselves? All of a sudden, that takes on a relatively imaginable and a relatively vivid and relatable perspective, because we all know what it means to want to eat a meal and to want to, be in a house when it rains. And so I think really creating these narratives of what could that future look like, that is an aspect that we're often lacking in strategy work. And it seems to me that turning the narrative around from wanting to reduce certain negative aspects of tourism towards really understanding what the positive, like the opportunities in a tourism context and a tourism situation are, can completely change the way that we move forward in what we do. And so the transition from sustainability as something that's oriented to the past, like past status quo, towards something that has potential and lies in the future, I think it's a completely different conversation and really opens up opportunity for us to get to work differently with everything that this industry already knows about sustainability.
It's a very interesting perspective. We're almost conditioned to look at the problem of tourism because we're very aware of it, and the things that don't work in tourism or the pain points that tourism creates, rather than, as you say, a future world, a future society, what that might look like, completely irrespective of tourism, and then look at how tourism can help to or play a role in shaping that. You've obviously done quite a lot of looking at different methods and techniques. Where would you say empathy comes into this?
Yeah, I think empathy as, a big aspect in design work is something that we're often just required to bring to the table, that we're just supposed to have when looking at the world right now, looking at the multiple crises that we come out of, especially the younger generations. That is a capacity that we really have to train and cultivate. And so I think we need to begin understanding empathy as something that we're not just equipped with, that we can all equally bring into, this kind of work, be it with sustainability or be it, in future capacities, but that we need to help each other cultivate that and take time to bring that into the equation. And I do believe that we all have different capacities to exercise empathy or to demonstrate empathy and to really make room for that maybe someone who works in a more artistically inclined profession might experience and express and perhaps visualize or make sensible in any other way empathy very differently from someone who is in a, let's say, more quantitative environment. And I think we should look towards, okay, how can we engage this different expression or even level of empathy that different professions have? And how can we bring that together into the conversation so that more people can understand and relate to the kind of work that we do?
Yeah, and I think tourism is an industry that if we have to tell the world what tourism is, if we think about presentations that destinations do, the amount of times I've heard professionals in our industry say it's all about the welcome, it's all about the people, it's about the individual experiences that the industry is trying to create, those exceptional interactions, then it seems like we have in essence, we understand how powerful human touch is, human contact, and that exchange of perspectives. But we don't always find it so easy to build into the work that we actually have to do for ourselves. It seems like what we're selling is actually something we also need to incorporate into our day-to-day methods and ways of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, tourism largely builds on a resource of care, right? The fact that we're able to care for each other, be that as a host, inviting someone into a foreign country, or be it as a guest, demonstrating respectful behavior towards the guest. That also goes for nature, of course. And honestly, unless we find ways to demonstrate more care, and that also meaning to find ways to empathize with more than human beings, I think we're relatively quickly grinding down the resources that the entire industry draws on.
It seems that the systems that we have thinking beyond tourism seem to be broken. When we think about the simple, quite easy to understand at a basic level, the environmental catastrophe that we seem to be heading towards, I can't help but feel that tourism wants to do something, but it seems difficult to see that it really will. And that's quite sad to kind of maybe have that feeling. There also is a lot of enthusiasm and excitement about this transition towards a sustainable future at the same time. So perhaps this is just what I'm feeling, but I don't know if you've got a sense that as an industry, we can really make a big impact. There's potential to really grasp that macro level thinking that's needed to get out of those narrow rabbit holes that we seem to be in and actually think about something that is bigger than us, bigger than our industry.
Yeah, I mean, during my PhD and the last 2.5 years, I've been practically been, swinging like a pendulum from absolute nihilism to the conviction that yes, we can do things. And so it's really obviously the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, but there's definitely a need to be able to work with both extremes because there will be days you look at the world and you're like, how is my little contribution ever going to make a difference? And then there are days when you meet someone who's maybe listened to one of your talks or who's been a student in your class and who says, I've been pursuing a little aspect that we've talked about before, and it really helps me understand the world differently. And then you realize, oh, there is an impact in this. And so I think a big part of this kind of work is really finding your own intentions in it and then allowing yourself to be reminded that there can be impacts in the work, but not holding yourself accountable to making the macro impacts by yourself. Because honestly, when we work on relatively small projects, in a PhD, for example, they can be very, very meaningful. And the amount of energy and exhilaration that comes out of that can really be quite incredible. And then you're invited to a big event and you see the people from the big airlines and airports and, the hotel chains and the travel agents getting together. And you're like, yeah. And here, you're just a drop in the ocean. And so there's navigating a lot of different levels of gravity in the industry. And that can be a challenging task. But I think it's important to keep an eye on the fact that we're cultivating small, like, pockets of impact. And that's good. That's good enough too. I mean, nothing's ever quite good enough. I mean, there's always more work to do, but that's at least a place to start.
And what do you think about leadership in this context? Because it seems that we've seen some very strong leadership in terms of the vocality of statements from presidents down to leaders from any one particular industry. But does leadership help carry this forward? It seems like the statements have carried us a certain way to making certain commitments, to giving a certain momentum to the problems we face. But it seems like the sort of design-based leadership is something completely different at the same time.
Yeah, I think leadership in the understanding of participatory processes, right? Leadership not as an exclusively top-down directionality, but leadership that enables dynamics and enables dialogue and that especially enables difference and dissonance and friction. Because unless we're able to argue about what we stand for and what our convictions are and where we see difficulties, I don't think much difference is ever going to come together. I think we've seen some of this in one of our previous experiments that we did, thinking about 2050, thinking about the role of the DMO in 2050, where we saw people coming together and constantly stating that they feel inhibited by politics and that national leadership for them was difficult because they're publicly mandated, when really they had so many ideas and so much drive to put things in motion and change. And we give them a small space to talk about that, in ways that lit excitement and that they could then bring back into their own work. And I think moments like that help endorse some kind of leadership, and they help maybe bring into question other kinds of leadership. And yeah, I think as a leader nowadays, one just has to be open to the fact that the own work might be criticized and that maybe we need to hear opinions on what's not working out and how maybe what people up top think is desirable is not what everybody else finds desirable.
Yeah, I think we certainly saw that. You're right. In that environment where we put out some really big questions, we bring people together who are not from the echo chamber of the same team or the same organization. They seem somehow able to be much more honest, much more outspoken, much more direct about their opinions, their desires, their dislikes, their frustrations. And that conversation that you're referring to was the workshop that you led at X Design Week about the 2050 futures. But we've seen this, I think, in the digital tourism think tank. We've seen this in roundtable environments where we close the door. And it seems to be the minute we say, this is not being recorded or this will not be shared, that everybody takes a deep breath and they feel like they're able to say what they really think. And I guess that kind of creating a pluralistic way of examining, thinking about things. And as you say, creating a culture of critique rather than
Yeah.
criticism, maybe it's a nicer
Yeah.
way to put
Yeah.
it, is something that's really, really needed in order to also create that empowerment. So if we think about leadership, it's also enabling people to be themselves, to be confident in their ideas. What are those moments through the last few years that you've been studying this entire area? What are those moments of enlightenment that really stand out to you, especially from looking at this in the field?
Yeah, I think one of the really big moments was when I at some point realized that I'm actually in the SDGs. When I was working with the SDGs in order to look at, okay, how might they actually visualize a preferable world, I got across the goal on wanting to stop discrimination of women and girls everywhere. And while I was trying to translate that, looking for an opposite to discrimination, I suddenly halted and realized I was like, oh my God, this protects me. Like this is standing up for my own being. And that had never happened before. And I found that a very powerful moment because all of a sudden I wasn't just someone who was called to action by the SDGs, but who was also a benefactor of what the SDGs were aspiring to. And really seeing that I was in that agenda somewhere. That was, yeah, a very powerful moment for me. Also in the sense of wanting to agree with it, being like, yeah, I feel like we should be more appreciated. I think that definitely was one of the major moments. And then actually really, as I've described before, this realization or this question of, wait a minute, what futures are we actually heading to? Does anybody have an image of the world that they're building with their strategies? Is that how we work with strategies at all? That we construct an image of a future that we want to get to and then decide on how we want to get there? That is definitely something that's quite profoundly informed how halfway through the PhD, I've practically changed direction and now looked at, okay, there's different ways of doing this. And then most recently in one of the talks that I gave when I was at ITB in March, someone told me that looking at all these ideas that I have about the future, potential futures of leisure and how tourism needs to take responsibility for new spare time that's opening up, they looked at me and point blank said, look, you're not solving a pain point for the industry with this kind of thinking. And while that was meant as a discouraging comment, I actually really, it took me a second and then it sunk in. I was like, and that is exactly the problem that we have. The fact that the futures that we're headed towards are not the difficulty of some of the futures that, we can imagine at this point, looking at the multiple crises that are happening. The fact that some of these don't seem threatening enough in order to get active, that is a real problem. And that's what we need to get active here. It's actually understanding the fact that we all have stakes in futures. And that means that all of us have to be called to action and that we all cannot be excused from action, whether or not we've been educated in futures thinking or not. It's just not optional anymore.
It's very interesting to almost be shut down when you're sharing such ideas and really creating such an open invitation to think about different scenarios, different ways we might be able to tackle things that we both do know, can see, and also those that we perhaps can't yet see. And I really like that idea of, and you shared it a few times, of can we work towards constructing an ideal future? Can we build a future that we want to see? And I think this is probably something that means very different things to different people in different cultures. Absolutely. And also different parts of the world. When you think about some of those countries that are rapidly diversifying or investing in completely different economies for the future, something like Saudi Arabia, I guess it invites the question, are they designing a country, a future, a society that for them is an ideal that they've set out? Have they included and incorporated the voices of the many in that process? And is there something about that approach that we can move all the way over to something like sustainability and trying to deal with the climate crisis, which scientifically we know is just right upon us? And I think it's maybe something that I can't really say I've seen in tourism, not to the extent of imagining a future and seeing if we can strategize to reach that. Strategies always seem, in actual fact, and I can't believe I'm saying this, to be reactionary, which seems almost bizarre because I don't think I would have ever thought before this conversation of a strategy as something that is a reaction to something. It feels like something proactive, but in actual fact, it seems to be more a reaction to trying to stay ahead, trying to stay on top of competition, rather than going out in a completely different direction to shape something unique. So that's really interesting.
That's the whole point of having these kinds of conversations, right? Is coming out with a sense of difference as to, oh, okay, there are things that I haven't yet considered, and there are things that I'm now beginning to see in a new light. Because that is also the idea of, or a benefit, let's say, of working with design-based approaches, as both you and I do. There's this opportunity of starting to see things as we make them, but starting to see things differently all of a sudden by making them. And so as we, for example, created a series of roundtable discussions that we're trying to scaffold around, okay, what kind of people might come? How might we invite them into conversation? How can we sort of get out of this Zoom fatigue that happened during COVID? And how does this making that, just sort of experimenting with participatory formats, not really knowing what to expect, that really changed how we understood and saw the situation. And that's, prototypically, this kind of conversation too aims at that, like looking at what do I take for granted in my environment, and maybe is there room to think about it differently?
Yeah, and that's in that example, within our team, we learned a lot by running the sustainability leadership program, because we learned people's response to that, and we learned people's motivations for even joining such a thing. And one of the things we learned, which is at least useful to understand, is that there were probably two major motivations. The first would be to get a certificate of some sort, to be able to say, I completed this, I've achieved this. So that probably wasn't at all even a priority for us when creating that, because we were really passionate about the ideas that we were putting into it. And I think the other was to be able to make a public statement. So in some sense, it's quite similar to the certificate, but it's maybe more at an organizational level, to be able to make a statement that you have taken part in such a program with such a name. So interesting, and perhaps to a certain extent disappointing, when what you really wanted was pure passion on the subject and
community, right? We really
exactly
want community. Yeah,
exactly. So that's something that I guess, if we consider empathy applies at every level to everybody, we had to try and understand why those motivations were so strong on those elements and much weaker on the elements that we'd actually tried to design the program around. And then capacity just seems to be an issue that I think seems to exist everywhere. The capacity to do something which doesn't deliver an instant result. So with the sustainability leadership program, it doesn't give you your sustainability strategy as a printout at the end of it. And I think for some that was disappointing, because the exploration and the ability to take some ideas away from that about how you might approach that seemed a very broad takeaway, where sometimes a very specific and exact outcome seems to be what is sought. But of course, this is just one scenario, one specific example. But I think it's a reminder that we go into every scenario with assumptions, and we need to be open to being challenged on those assumptions and open to learning from those. And I think you were also talking about designing that future and outcomes. One of those aspects of design thinking is designing outcomes. What is the successful outcome that we want a user to be able to achieve? So that's often looked at, especially in tech environments, we want a user to be able to reach the checkout page on a website, for example, or we would like them to complete and book. But we can also apply that to bigger problems. So we want them to be able to make a conscious or a sustainable choice and feel satisfied about that. And I think sometimes that is an area that we've found is always a conflict, and there's there's a need to kind of teach and coach people in terms of what we mean by outcome, because we often see people trying to create a solution at that point. So they will tell you, so if they click there and they click that, then they will book. And that's where we have to say that this is not the outcome. This is you designing a process to that outcome based on your assumptions and not leaving enough space to consider that those might be wrong, or there might be another 1,000 ideas about how to reach the same goal. So yeah, I guess this is all very, very interesting. But going back to that comment about what sounds like a very interesting ITB experience, have you come across times when there's just not the openness to, or even the willingness to think in this direction, to create a space, or to even consider creating the space for a sort of a more open approach to considering futures?
Yeah, certainly. I think I have the unfortunate habit of really trying to provoke people when I'm given a microphone. And so there have been a few occasions where I've really tried to get across this whole idea of, okay, futures thinking gives us a different way of looking at what's going on and where we might be heading. And that really turned into situations where I massively offended people in the sense of, now this young lady who doesn't even have a PhD yet marches in and tells us that what we're doing is outdated. And so I feel like changing the conversation is a quite delicate matter. One of the things that I definitely encountered was where someone told me, look, the scenario thing is nice, but I studied that in the 70s. And to them, that was a moment of justifying, we already know how to do this. Like, you're not telling us anything new. And for me, that was a moment of complete surprise as to, you've known this since the 70s. And we still got to the point that we are today. Maybe collectively as an industry, we need to rethink what we've been doing. If supposedly we've been working on sustainability since the 70s and been studying that systematically, in universities, then somewhere between the 70s and now, we made a lot of errors in judgment. That's a bit of a problem. And so there's definitely conversations like this that come up, especially intergenerationally, where people just feel uncomfortable with the thought of now having to learn a different way. I've definitely been in situations where the young people and the women were really on board with what I had to say, but where the men really weren't, often because they're in positions of power and they really don't like when that's being questioned. And so I've definitely found myself in politically somewhat difficult, challenging situations while wanting to make space for futures thinking. I think I'm just still trying to find a way to have that conversation, because as a young person right now, I am worried and I expect more of the industry. And I think when really pointing to difficulties, challenges, and situations that are simply wrong, then that expectation as to we can do better, why don't we, gets lost. And so, yeah, I've definitely been in those situations, some of which I would definitely not like to recreate ever. But I just know that these conversations have to be had. And if it has to be me, then I'll do it.
It does seem like navigating the spaces, it can be quite challenging. And you're dealing with egos, you're dealing with confidence, you're dealing with things
and accomplishments, like life accomplishments. Of course, nobody wants that taken away or disqualified.
So that must be always treading a fine balance, a delicate mix of not always knowing the personal kind of sentiment that the person you're engaging will be coming from. And on the other end of the scale, if we also try to address, you were talking about poverty before, that's equally sensitive for very, very different reasons. And people will have different experiences of that, including, as you were also talking about, as a woman, also seeing that the SDGs stand up for you and they speak to your rights and to what you can achieve and what you should be able to achieve. And I guess everybody then, when we think about any scenario, has a unique perspective, and that's both a richness, but it's also something that we need to be able to understand. When we face those kind of barriers, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's trying to create an openness to thinking about things, whether that's through co-design or in other areas, if we struggle to succeed or to achieve that, or we face a lot of pushback, would that be down to us as leaders or facilitators? to find a different way? Is it also for us to find the empathy and the way to understand why that pushback is coming?
I think so. I think understanding where pushback is coming from and what motivates it is really important to then learning how to have the conversation. Because I really don't think that people are by default closed off to having that conversation, especially if you then, look towards people potentially having grandchildren already. And that's a very obvious stake in the future, as a grandparent who might now be in a position of power, let's say in the tourism industry. I'm sure you could speak to that person and be like, look, don't you want for your grandchild to be able to still hang out in the forest and actually, see some of these natural wonders? Obviously, that's like pretty personal, but I think there's ways to create or to remind people of stakes that they themselves have in their futures. And when you know where pushback is coming from, then you can sort of navigate around that and maybe find ways, methods, or even occasions for having these kinds of conversations. I do also believe, however, that there is room for a hard cutoff when you realize that the organization that you're with does not at all represent these kinds of values that you've come to cultivate over time. I can understand why people would have to part ways, because I think that's something that we need to be very honest about right now. There are huge differences in values between long-standing companies and their employees. Also, of course, between younger companies and their employees. But I guess the larger you are as an organization and the more maybe historical weight and gravity you have, of course, maneuvering becomes eternally more difficult. And that's something that we have to, look towards. Okay, do we have the patience to see a long-standing change through, or do we just not have the patience? Do we feel like right now is the time for us to get active? I think it definitely comes down to the individual in order to motivate and drive larger change in an organizational and therefore more macro environment.
I think on that note, it's a great point to end on. Certainly one of the things that I've taken away from this is we need to be more relatable. We need to be able to relate more to others as well. And my own frustration sometimes of seeing an industry that talks a lot about something like sustainability, even makes significant steps in some ways, but not the really important ways. Perhaps it's also to say, well, how can I as an individual and how can others also make that bigger, perhaps more urgent priority of addressing the macro level changes more relatable, more urgent, more important, something that is creating passion and a determination to solve. So I guess when we unpackage everything, there are nuances everywhere, and we really need to be able to bring those human skills, those human aspects right out into the fore. It's been a really great series with you, Birthe, and of course it's also been fantastic to collaborate with you over the last couple of years now, and to learn from you, but also to get really inspirational perspectives from your even sometimes just your reaction or your observation. I think that fly on the wall has actually been really, really valuable through this process. And in this series in particular, I think bringing together those two completely different perspectives on futures has been just really, really interesting, because it has shown us that there are very, very different ways of considering how we might work, how we might exist in an environment where we think about the impact and the role that we can have on that. If we look back on that, be your biggest highlight from those two conversations, what sticks with you since we had those conversations?
Yeah, I think one thing was the metaphor that we discussed at the beginning of the session with Ian, right? And that's something that actually we reflected on with Peter after finishing our first session, was the fact that tourism itself is so proficient in engaging with the unknown. It is the essence, it lies at the heart of what this industry does, if more in geographical and cultural terms. But I feel like we can, as an industry, really leverage that and use that and bring it to a different purpose of encountering and willingly encountering unknown futures in order to make them preferable ones. And I think that metaphor is actually really strong. And that's maybe a new lens for how we might consider the kind of work that we do, be it in training, in education, or in practice.
Well, that brings this series to a close. Thanks again to Birthe for guiding us through these different perspectives and those fascinating discussions. Birthe has been instrumental in bringing together a couple of really interesting guests on this series, and her own passion for tourism co-design and sustainable tourism development has helped us to really explore a number of different perspectives and think about the methods and approaches that we might take to try to address some of the pressing needs when it comes to sustainability in a more effective way. And also to have that ability to step back and ask critical questions such as, is what we're doing relevant? Is the direction we're going in actually likely to have an impact? And how might we look at things a little bit differently so we can design a future that we would actually like to see, rather than one that perhaps we feel is simply inevitable? For me, on a personal level, this has been a fascinating series to follow, and I've certainly enjoyed all of the discussions. We'll be back very soon with a third series, so make sure you've subscribed to the series to be notified as soon as we release that next series. And if you're curious to learn a little bit more about the Digital Tourism Think Tank, head over to thinkdigital.travel, where we have lots of interesting research, content, case studies, and you can also find out more about all of our other podcast series that are done with a range of different partners, offering a number of different takes on the tourism industry, which you will probably find quite interesting. Thanks a lot for joining, and if you did enjoy, be sure to leave a review.